While tomorrow's budget will undoubtedly have winners and losers, it also presents an opportunity, though, for the Prime Minister to rally Canadian support around his agenda or lose the narrative if Canadians do not agree with what Mark Carney is proposing. To talk about this, we're now joined by polls analyst Eric Grenier, the founder and the writer behind the Writ. Eric, hello to you.
Hi, Michael.
Listen, I want to talk a bit about the potential pitfall and potential gain here of the budget, but I think it's probably worthwhile to talk about where things stand when it comes to polling numbers and this Prime Minister. Because when you look at the approval ratings, when you look at Abacus data, for example, they say Conservatives are now in the lead. If you look at others, they say Liberals still have the greater support in the country. What do you make of those numbers?
I do think that it does suggest that there isn't really a huge advantage for either the Liberals or the Conservatives in the polls at this stage. As you mentioned, we have seen some polls that have the Conservatives ahead, but when we do see those kinds of polls, the margin is usually quite small and within the margin of error. When we do see some polls with the Liberals ahead, it's either the same kind of close race or maybe a bit of a wider lead for the Liberals. So overall, that does kind of suggest that the portrait hasn't shifted all that much since the last election. And it was almost a Liberal majority last time, so it is a bit of a roll of the dice, and maybe there would be production of a majority government for the Liberals or even a closer minority government between the two parties than what we saw last time. So I think that's where we are heading into this consideration for the budget vote, is that sure, either of the two parties could want to go into an election because they could end up in a better position after it, but both of them could also not want to go into an election because they could end up in a worse position. It's not like in the fall of 2024 where there was a clear incentive for the Conservatives, for the Bloc Québécois to take advantage of Liberal weakness. In this context, it is pretty much status quo.
Yeah, status quo, bearing in mind that the Liberals are 3 votes shy of a majority, so they are going to need someone to either abstain or support them to get this budget passed. But, Mark Carney, when you talk about there's no advantage when it comes to party standings, it certainly changes over preferred Prime Minister. And really, that's the narrative that we've had ever since Mark Carney became Liberal leader. Is that correct?
Yeah, absolutely. And if the Liberals are jonesing for an election, it would be because Mark Carney has that advantage over Pierre Poilievre. Nanos research continues to show a 20-plus point lead for Mark Carney over Pierre Poilievre on preferred Prime Minister. And we also did see a few polls out over the last week asking Canadians who they would prefer to balance the budget without hurting them, who they would prefer for economic growth. And Mark Carney has an advantage over Pierre Poilievre. So over the course of a campaign, if one did get kicked off, maybe that advantage would start to tell and push the Liberal numbers further. But if we are in a bit of a polarized electorate where it is primarily party brand that is keeping the Conservatives afloat, it might not matter much that Mark Carney has that edge over Pierre Poilievre.
Okay, but now comes in this budget as of tomorrow. Arguably, this will be the first time Canadians will get a glimpse into how the Prime Minister intends to turn his words into action. What will be important for the Prime Minister to convey with this budget, do you think?
I do think they have to convey a level of, I'm not sure how to put it, but not to be going too far. It has to have a level of pragmatism in it, because all the polling that's been done over the last little while still suggests that Canadians, they prefer not to be in a deficit position. They prefer to see a balanced budget, but they do understand that deficits can be necessary. And if the deficit is funding spending towards their priorities, that they can live with it. So if we do see a budget that comes out on Tuesday that is, sure, a big deficit number, but the case is well made that it is meant to be investing, as Mark Carney is often saying, rather than just reckless spending. I think the fact that Mark Carney has that advantage on trust from Canadians on his economic management, that it will go over well enough for Canadians. I think there isn't this desire to see drastic cuts to balance the budget in the same way that there isn't a desire to see massive spending to deal with problems like we saw during the pandemic.
Mm-hmm. You talk about, the spending and the investment, and I do wonder what the Prime Minister needs to focus in on here, if at all, because from the polling I've seen, affordability is still the top concern amongst Canadians. But the Prime Minister, he doesn't talk about affordability in terms of things like an excess profit tax on grocers. He talks about investments. What kind of sell will the Prime Minister have to do to get people on side if affordability is how they define their concern?
I think a lot of it does have to be axed towards that affordability question, the cost of living question, even if it is investments in big projects or if it's investments in defense spending. If it does mean instead that some of that money that is going towards these large ticket items will have benefits for Canadians, either in higher salaries or reduced costs in the longer run, then I think it could have some resonance. But there does need to be a focus on cost of living, because as you mentioned, that is still by far the top issue of Canadians. Yes, the economy, Donald Trump, healthcare system, housing affordability, they rank highly as issues, but cost of living is the top one. And when you see polling that was done, for example, by Ipsos, and it suggests what they want to see in the budget, it is measures to either reduce taxes or just to reduce the cost of living. So if the budget does put an emphasis on that, or if at least the message from the budget puts an emphasis on that this will reduce the cost of living for Canadians, then it could resonate with Canadians. If, on the other hand, it is seen as a budget with a lot of spending that might impact Canadians in 10, 20 years, then I think there could be a vulnerability for the Liberals that they're seen as not addressing the top issue for Canadians right now, which remains the pocketbook.
Mm-hmm. You mentioned Donald Trump, and we know during the election when the Liberals mentioned Donald Trump, or if Donald Trump ever had a news conference, they actually bumped up Mark Carney's numbers. Where does Donald Trump fit into this budget? Is that an issue that Canadians will be looking for, do you think?
I do think so. He's still one of the big issues when asked directly, what is an issue facing the country? I do think that the specter of Donald Trump is hanging around all the other issues. We did see polling that was done by Ipsos asking what was behind the cost of living increases. One of them was inflation. One of them was the government spending. But another one was Donald Trump and the tariffs. So if people are feeling the crunch from inflation and cost of living, some of the blame does go south of the border to Donald Trump. So I do think that while it isn't the top issue in the same way, the emotional issue that it was in the federal election campaign in March and April, I do think it is still there. It is something that we can't avoid. It is something we can't ignore. It's in the news every day, Donald Trump and what he's doing in the country, what he's doing in terms of our relationships with them. So I think it does need to address that. But if it is just about Donald Trump, I don't think it has as much of a resonance as it did back in April.
Okay, so we will keep an eye out as to how they message this budget, the arguments they make around it. Eric, we'll speak again. Thank you for this. Appreciate it.
All right. Thanks, Michael.
That's Eric Grenier.